your song ease my heart. Take my tears on your long journey to the ocean's heart. You are one with the ocean. May her waters ever be free, ever cleansing my spirit as it travels to the sea. In my veins I feel your waters, ever singing through me. And when time does take my spirit, please do take me to your sea. Oh, sweetly singing river, let your song ease our hearts. Take our tears on your long journey to the ocean's heart. You are one with the ocean. Let her waters ever be free, ever cleansing our spirits as they travel to the sea.
Om Asato Ma Sadagamaya Tamaso Maham Jyotir Gamaya Mrityormam Amritam Gamaya Avir Ahavir Maedhi Rudra Yate Dakshinam Mukham Tena Maham Pahayanityam. Om, lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality, and reach us through and through ourselves, and evermore protect us from ignorance by thy sweet, compassionate face. So my subject this morning is the spiritual quest. And we're going to be talking about spiritual life as a hero's journey, as a high adventure, and as a long search for enlightenment. And I'm going to use as my basic text this morning to illustrate our theme is a classic of French Arthurian literature entitled Le Quest del Saint Graal, The Quest of the Holy Grail, written by a French Cistercian monk in the 14th century. Now, the quest is a romantic narrative, and it has all the qualities of an Arthurian romance. Kings and queens, princes and knights, and fair ladies, and evil sorcerers, and dragons, and adventure. But all of the motifs that are employed in the narrative are meant to be interpreted symbolically as illustrative of aspects of spiritual life. And therefore, the quest of the Grail can be read as an allegory for our own spiritual quest and our own search. Now, the story is set in the 5th century during the reign of King Arthur in ancient Britain in the town of Camelot. Was a legendary king, and it was Camelot portrayed as like a utopian kingdom, ruled by a wise and worthy king, and loyal and patriotic knights, prosperous merchants, and happy peasants. And what emerged, we get a picture of an idealized kingdom that looks almost like a heaven on earth. But as the story opens, we find that their difficulties have arisen. That is, there's a complications at the beginning, where the plot begins. And there's trouble in paradise. The king has fallen ill. He's sick. He's unable to rule wisely and well. He's lost a lot of his sovereignty. In addition to that, there's been a 7-year drought. There's been no rain. And there's no greening out of the fields. And so there's no crops. So there's there's famine in the land. People have nothing to eat, nothing to drink. And it's kind of the kingdom has been reduced to a wasteland. And the wasteland without symbolizes the increasing wasteland within the collective consciousness of the people. That is, they're suffering. They've lost hope. They've lost their optimism. And they've fallen away from their high ideals. And in fact, they're living in a kind of state of existential despair. Now, all of you are familiar, maybe, with the talk about this concept of the wasteland. You're familiar with the word from the title of what's perhaps the most famous poem of the 20th century, by the title of a poem by the same name, by T.S. Eliot, written particularly to characterize the mood and the state of the collective consciousness of the Western world during the modernist period after World War I, when civilizations were in a state of physical devastation, and more importantly, people had lost faith and belief in Enlightenment ideals of progress and reason and universal moral truths, beginning of what we would call today the existentialist worldview. And many of the lines there in The Wasteland are still quoted today in postmodern literature. It's an interesting poem. You can't really read it. It goes on for page after page after page. But it's interesting to us as students of Vedanta. He's always quoting the Upanishads. The whole structure of the poem is in five big sections, patterned after the emergence of the five elements of elements of antiquity. And he draws allusions from the Upanishads. And it ends with the classic benediction, Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. So maybe we can find some Vedantic associations with that famous poem. But as the story, go back to the story of the quest. The story of the quest begins on the feast of Pentecost. And all of the knights of the Round Table have taken their seats at the table. And you can see kind of an image of this reproduction in the 14th century of the Round Table, still preserved today in England, Winchester Castle. You can see close-ups of it in 25 places. So let's say that there are 25 Grail Knights. And they've taken their place at the table. One place was always vacant. It was called the perilous seat. Anyone who sat there would be immediately burned and consumed in fire, unless they were destined to be the one who discovered the Holy Grail. And on that occasion, when the knights had taken their seats, well, a knight walked in, Sir Percival, he sat down in the perilous seat. Yeah, no problem. So they do, yes, okay. The table, the Round Table is now complete. It's like a mandala. The whole thing is all about, the whole story is a circular. It's about a great movement and a great cycle of story. And as it begins, no sooner had they taken their seats than there appeared before them a great apparition of the Holy Grail. Now, the Grail, as you know, refers to that cup or chalice that held the wine during the Passover feast of the Last Supper, associated with Jesus and his disciples. And it came to be symbolize spiritual sustenance and the whole process of spirituality, we could say. The veil symbolizes spiritual enlightenment or spirituality. And as soon as they saw this grail, it had a transformative effect on the knights and their consciousness, as if it was calling to them, and they realized that they had a great calling. It's a great call to each one of them felt a great call to adventure, that is to possess that grail, to find it, to find out its secret, to locate it, and to make a journey in order to gain the mystery and the knowledge of the Grail. That became their conviction. And each one, therefore, with this great calling, prepared to set out on the adventure. And each one in their turn, they took leave of their wives and their family and their friends, and they mounted on their horses with all their armor, their weapons and accoutrements of the knights. And they set off. They departed from the city, off into the forest, kind of a symbolic leaving behind of the bright lights of civilization into the gloomy shadows of the forest adventurous, leaving behind all of their things that were familiar to them, all the things that they were, that their attachments, all their loves, all the things that defined them, leaving behind their past, as it were, and setting off into a whole new, unexplored world, leaving behind the safety of the city to go into the dangers of the unknown forest, leaving the old to venture into the new. And so the knights set off. And they set off into the uncharted, unexplored forest. Now the forest, as you know in Western narratives, the forest often is associated, well, for one thing, with magic, talking trees and talking flowers and animals, and magical happenings, but associate also with great perils and danger, high cliffs and maybe rushing waterfalls, dangerous animals, and witches, giants, dragons. This is the forest of Western folklore. The forest, if we compare that with the forest of Indian mythology, we see it's quite radically different. The Indian forest that we read about in the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and the great epics, we know is always associated with spirituality. And if you wanted to be really spiritual in ancient India, well, you pretty much had to go to the mountains or go to the forest. And in fact, when you go to the forest, there's the place where all the saints and the sages and the rishis. It's a place of peace and of tranquility, and it's a place of refuge. Ramayana, Rama, Sita, the Pandava brothers spent many years in the forest after they had been banished from their kingdom, or after they had left their kingdoms. And there they lived in the forest. So, in the quest, that is in the story, the Grail quest, we can see that this image of the forest is kind of a little bit of both. And the knights are very soon going to encounter adventures. But they also know that they're kind of on an esoteric quest. Their expedition is not a military expedition. They're on they know that it's on a spiritual quest. And they know too that they have to have some more esoteric knowledge than they already possess. And in fact, as they go deeper and deeper to the forest, there they come upon a great monastery. It's a Cistercian monastery. And the Cistercians were part of the Benedictine order, the Roman Catholic monks. And so their monks and spiritual fathers lived there in this monastery. And it's there in the monastery that those monks took up some time. There they stopped, and they began to learn. And they began to study the teachings of the Holy Fathers. And in fact, they became disciples of the Fathers. And that they were all initiated into different forms of spiritual practice. And so we see here that there's quite a radical shift is taking place in the image or the idea of the knight in shining armor. Because now their process or their project, they realized after they had become disciples, and their quest before them, they realized that they had to apply themselves to acquiring heavenly virtues. You see, they were already knights in shining armor. That is, they were already men who were highly revered and respected as members of the aristocracy and as nobles. They had heroic, noble virtues of courage, of bravery, of honor, and they had great moral character. This was all part of being a knight of the Round Table, kind of like a Japanese samurai who subscribed to a very strict code of military honor. And so they already had that character, but they realized that this was not enough, that for the spiritual quest, that they needed to have more, that would require something more than heroic qualities, what we would call the classical Greek moral virtues, and in fact would require more than the traditional Christian moral virtues. They needed heavenly virtues. They needed spiritual virtues. Let's look a little at the difference between three words: ethics, morality, and spirituality. Now, ethics is just means an ethical person is a person who lives in accord with the norms of society. Society has to draw the line somewhere in order to establish certain standards of civilization. And an ethical person is a person who is socialized and who supports those basic standards and has internalized those standards psychologically. And therefore, if he's a businessman, that he knows very well that in his business there is a code of ethics, which is there posted on all the bulletin boards to ensure professionalism and to ensure customer satisfaction. Now, morality is something quite different, because morality means living in accord with God's law and with God's words. Now, God, by which we understand Judeo-Christian, monotheistic God, personal God, creator, preserver, and destroyer of this world, he gave the 10 commandments. No, he did not command us to be moral saints. Most of the commandments, if not all, are phrased in negative terms. That is, these are prohibitions. God realized we're not ready for sainthood yet. We need to work on the 7 deadly sins. So that's where they focus. So it's all about what we, in common parlance, what we mean by a moral person. We mean a person who eschews the 7 deadly sins, who's struggling to rise above that. And by a man of moral character, we would say he is a man of good character, if in fact he has a clean record, he hasn't been arrested for anything, and as a result of which, his life, pretty much, he's living in accord with, he's pleasing to God. His life is pleasing to God. He's not sinning. Sinning here means, by sin, we mean doing something displeasing to God and which works against the collective welfare. And therefore, the man of good character, his life is naturally works for the welfare of the many and the happiness of the many, just by the fact that he's doing his dharma and that he's living a moral and ethical life. Now, spirituality is a third word, category. Spirituality is a word that we really don't hear too much about in Christian, in history of Christian theology. It's a word that appears more in the context of mysticism. And by spirituality and mystic Christianity, what they mean is not just avoiding sin, but they mean active engagement in purification, sanctification, purgation, and up-leveling an alchemical change in your whole character and psyche. That's what they mean by that's spirituality. By spirituality, they mean a spiritual person in the mystic tradition of Christianity is a person who is living in imitation of Christ. That's in other words, a very high ideal. Now, of course, in Vedanta, spirituality, if we were to ask a Vedantan what is spirituality, we see that the word has taken on it includes all the previous, includes but transcends, but includes, but it takes on a whole new meaning, because in Indian philosophy, we have the idea of the Atman, that is the impersonal self. And we have the idea of the impersonal God. That means the whole context of spirituality without a personal God. And so the scope of the definition of what is spirituality becomes unlimited. So the knights, go back to the story. The knights, their challenge, their discipline now is to move through this progression and to move up beyond their heroic qualities, established in moral self-discipline, and to acquire spiritual qualities. What are those qualities in particular? Well, that's a vast subject. That's because in Vedanta, there are different paths of spirituality. Each path has a certain criterion chart before you could even begin those. That is, there's certain virtues which you have to acquire before you can begin those yogic practices. And each one of those sets of virtues, although they're all work together, each one of those sets of virtues have their own distinctive qualities. So, these are the heavenly virtues. Now the knights, they had moral virtues, and now they're acquiring these heavenly virtues. And we can kind of sympathize with the knights because they've spent their whole life, they've lived their whole lives as being in the highest, in the aristocracy. That is, they've lived as the highest class of society. And now they have to learn the virtue of humility. That is in that Cistercian monastery. They've lived their whole lives as military conquerors. And now they have to learn something about self-surrender. And so see, it's a challenge. It's a big challenge for them to make this change. They were masters of weaponry, masters of horsemanship. And now they're being asked to beat their swords into plowshares. That means their physical weapons are not really going to be as such, have to come to assume a more symbolic form of the virtues of their own character. And we know, by the way, as students of comparative religion, you know that if you study Indian mythology, that you look at the iconography of the gods and the goddesses, you know that each one has in their hands many magical accessories, many of which are weapons. And that these weapons, of course, are all symbolic in nature. Like, for example, maybe the most famous example is the sword, which in spiritual traditions always signifies the sword of discrimination. So the knights set off, and now they are going to leave the monastery. They're setting off, and every knight now goes, they take divergent paths. Each one has a storyline that's unfolding, that becomes a whole plot in and of itself. And the literature, it's a vast literature there of the during that period of the tales of the Round Table. So they're going to have adventures, and they're going to have trials and tribulations, and each one of them are going to go through experiences that will test and will reveal to themselves aspects of their character. For example, maybe the most famous of the knights, Sir Lancelot, he sets off. He very soon stops late at night at an abandoned chapel. He goes inside and he falls asleep. And while he's asleep, he dreams that there's a sound outside. A wounded knight has come to the chapel. The wounded knight saddles up Lancelot's horse and rides off in pursuit of the Holy Grail. And when Lancelot awakens, of course, he realizes that this was no dream. This was a vision. He goes outside, his horse is gone. And in fact, then he's called to introspection. He realizes he's failed already. He realizes that his ruling ambition was always pride. He was a heroic servant of the queen, not of the king. Sir Galahad, very soon, in the course of his adventures, has to fight and to compete in a jousting tournament. And so you have all the excitement of the jousting, which he barely wins. Sir Gawain has a long encounter with the Green Knight, which in itself is a whole long alliterative poem in English, famous poem in Middle English. He defeats the Green Knight. And Sir Percy battles with the Black Knight. And Sir Percy also finds himself in the presence of a splendid pavilion. With all the tent of the pavilion, he's hearing beautiful music. And he comes in there, leaves his horse outside, comes in. Oh, there's a big feast which is spread there. And there's wine, women, and song. And there he's graciously welcomed in by the beautiful woman. And time passes, and the music plays, and the laughter increases. But at one point, Sir Percival realizes what's happened. He makes the sign of the cross. And as soon as he makes the sign of the cross, the woman shrieks. She goes up in flame and smoke. The pavilion disappears. And he realizes he's been tempted by the dark forces. Well, you can see the flavor. This is a medieval, religious. You can see this is not just religious, this is monastic. This is otherworldly spirituality that's being discussed here in this narrative. And so trials and tribulations. The knights go through this. Eventually they reach to the, they've determined now, they've located the place of the Holy Grail at a place called the Castle Corbenic. And they reach there. They reach the castle. At that time, there are only 3 knights left. Out of the 25, only 3 have reached this far. That is Sir Galahad, Sir Percival, and Sir Bors. And we can see immediately, you can think of the 6th chapter there, the Bhagavad Gita, where the famous verse where it says, among thousands of people, maybe one person becomes interested in spirituality. And among those who do become interested, among 1,000 of those who do become interested, maybe one actually begins to do spiritual practices. And so like that, the numbers decrease pretty rapidly. So here what we have is we have 3 are left. And they come to the castle. Now it's like a magical castle, in a way, because it's, it's guarded by lions. And there's the moat, reminds us, of course, of the famous spiritual, the classic, the interior castle of St. Teresa. Outer courtyard, inner courtyard, go inside, cross the moat into the inner apartments. The rooms have wonders in the rooms. You go into one room and there's a maiden who is in a cauldron of boiling water. You go in another room, anyone who attempts to spend the night in that room is assailed but with flaming arrows. You go in another room, and there's it leads to the outside. There is tied to a dragon outside. So like this, they make their way through the wondrous castle, and they come into the inner apartments, and they come to the chapel. Deep in the castle, they find the chapel, and it's there that they're welcomed by Joseph of Arimathea, famous figure from the Christian Bible, who oversaw the burial of Jesus. And so now they're in the presence of the saints. And the Joseph is beginning the celebration of the sacrament of the Eucharist. And there appears before them the knights. The Grail appears. And in fact, on that occasion, they kind of realize the essence. They realize that which they've been searching for. And Sir Galahad goes into a deep state of ecstasy, of apotheosis, that is, complete transformation. Later on, he does not return to consciousness, but he's interred there in the castle itself. Sir Percival also goes into a high state of ecstasy. When he comes down, he renounces his knighthood and joins there the monastery. He becomes a monk in the monastery at Corbenic. And Sir Bors also having a high state of spiritual realization. His mind comes down to the normal plane, but he was a little different. He thought how wonderful this was. Now we know about the Grail. It's safekeeping. We will return to Camelot and bring them the good news. And you remember, Sri Ramakrishna says, 4 travelers going along, and they come to a great wall. Yeah, I wonder what's on the other side of this wall. One of them climbs up, he looks over, and there he sees a mart of joy, of great happiness. And seeing that happiness, he says, and he jumps over. And the other 3 say, what's up there? Second one climbs up, he sees that mart of joy, he says, he jumps over. The third one does the same. But the 4th traveler, he climbs up, he sees the joy, and he thinks to himself, if I jump over, no one will know about this. And so he decides to climb back down and tell the passers-by about what is on the other side of the wall. So similarly it is Sir Bors. He returns to Camelot for the good news, carrying the knowledge of the Grail. And having this saving knowledge now, the king is restored to health and to sovereignty. And lo and behold, the spring comes, and the rains begin to fall, and there's greening out of the fields. Prosperity returns to the kingdom. People get a bit happier, recall their optimism and their joy. And thus we see the great cycle is complete. Now, this story of the Holy Grail is a religious narrative, but it very soon escalates into a mystical quest and into a spiritual quest. And in fact, it has, if we analyze it, we see that it has certain stages of progression, stages which form kind of a template for the story, which students of mythology have called the typical template, called the monomyth, or the heroic journey. It's called a heroic journey because it's all about heroes. Heroes who have a high calling. Now, these are not existential heroes. They're not absurdist heroes. They're not anti-heroes. They're not the kind of heroes that we usually think about from the movies. These are heroes who have a high moral commitment, who are a principled commitment. They set off, that's the hero's journey. It begins with a call to adventure. The call to adventure is heeded. They not only hear it, but they heed the call. And they begin to follow their calling, just as Jesus, when he appeared there before the brothers on the Lake of Galilee. He sees there the brothers, Simon, Peter, Andrew. He says that they were mending their fishing nets. He says, "Come, follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men." What do? They just dropped their nets. And they followed the calling. So similarly in the monomyth, the hero follows the calling. He passes through a period of initiation, the great threshold crossing, and then of purification, sanctification, acquisition of heavenly virtues. These are stages. Then there are other stage there, trials. They have to go through trials and tribulations. Finally, they reach their goal, achieve apotheosis, that is self-transformation, and realization, and return to the source. These are the stages of this classical circle of story. It's a cycle which you can read if you read any great biography of a saint. If you read through the classical epics of ancient times, if you read through the classic folklore and fairy tales, many share this monomythic structure. And it's useful to us kind of, for our help us, kind of gives us a map where we can kind of look at our spiritual quest and kind of how, in my story, where am I at? Where am I at now? Where have I come from? Where am I going? Because eventually we're all returning to the source. So I chose to speak this morning about this on this theme, because I think that art, that fine art and literature, whether it is ancient, medieval, modern, or contemporary, is very helpful to us in our spiritual life. We have before us great high ideals that are outlined in the Vedanta philosophy. They're very high ideals. Our goal and purpose as students of spiritual life is to realize those ideals. The problem is that philosophy, that is, by philosophy we mean ontology, epistemology, metaethics, all seem to us sometimes to be rather abstract, rather metaphysical, rather removed from anything understandable or down to earth. And we're in the predicament there of Arjuna in the second chapter of the Gita, where after listening to the highest flight of the Vedanta philosophy, verse after verse of high philosophy, at the very end, Arjuna, hearing all this, he stops and he asks Sri Krishna a question. He says, yes, all that you've said is very inspiring. Talking here about the man of steady wisdom, the man of self-knowledge. It's all very inspiring, he says, but tell me, I want to know one thing. How does he walk? How does he talk? What does he do? How does he behave? This is his question. That is, Arjuna wants some to be able to visualize the goal. He wants to be able to bring it before his mind's eye. And this is, in fact, also our requirement. With abstract philosophy, we have to do something to make that abstract philosophy to bring it down to earth, to make it more, to visualize it in our own life, to make it more concrete. And in fact, a great help in this regard is by reading the lives of the saints and the epics and the famous narratives of literature and history, because, as they say, art is concretized philosophy. And therefore, by reading those classic works, will help us to analyze and to reflect on our own spiritual quest.
I've seen the mountains and raise a many bright full moons. I've danced on the shores of mighty oceans and listened to earth's songs and to her tunes. This earth's filled up with many treasures. She gives many pleasures too. Still the greatest treasure I've ever found is in my heart and in yours too. I've known the earthquake and her power, seen lightning reaching through the plains. I've heard the rolling songs of thunder, felt the hot torrential rains. I've seen the minutes turn to hours and days to years just flying by. And through all of this time, I'm ever grateful that your love is by my side. I've known dark nights filled up with sorrow and felt bright days filled up with joy. I pray that joy will replace all sorrow, that peace will touch each girl and every boy, in every land and every nation, in every mind and every heart. May thy love ever protect us as we each do play our part. I've seen the sunrise in the mountains and raise a many bright full moons. I've danced on the shores of mighty oceans, listened to her songs and to her tunes. This earth's filled up with many treasures. She gives many pleasures too. Still the greatest treasure I've ever found is in the heart of me and you. Yes, the greatest treasure I've ever found is in the heart of me and you.
So subject next Sunday is meant to be free, and Swami Chidbrahmananda will speak. Om Dyo Shanti, Antariksha Shanti, Prithivi Shanti, Apa Shanti, Oshadaya Shanti, Vanaspataya Shanti, Vishwe Deva Shanti, Brahma Shanti, Saravam Shanti, Shantireva Shanti, Same Shantiredhi, Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Om, peace is in heaven, peace is on the earth, peace is in the sky and in the waters. The herbs and plants and trees are full of peace. The gods are peaceful. May this eternal universal peace enter our souls and beings. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto us all.